So I've just turned. We are ready to go. I'm having a wonderful conversation with British composer John Scott, who is wearing the extremely sharp bow tie, clearly self what do you call that? Self-tied, which makes you a much more esteemable figure, and clarinetist, among other things, a million things, clarinetist Mike Vaccaro with the, if I may say so, stylish cap. And I'm just, me here. We are speaking across a rather large distance. Mike is in Los Angeles, Mike Vaccaro, and John Scott is in the United Kingdom. And we are going to speak now in this little chat about the 2020, as in this year, ADC recordings release, The Chamber Music of John Scott, and Other Delicious Morsels. That is literally the title of the CD, and here's why. On that CD, John Scott's Clarinet Quintet, we'll discuss that wonderful piece. Mike shows us that he can play everything in sight, including probably the kitchen sink with the Bach movement from Bach's solo flute sonata. John Scott's A Week in October for Sax Quartet, another dandy piece. We'll talk about it. Theo Carlier, I don't know this composer, but the piece is called Du Style for solo clarinet, and it's from. We'll discuss it, a book of etudes for trumpet, but it just lies, as Mike will tell us, beautifully for clarinet, and it's just a wonderful piece as well. It's not just a study for an instrument. And then two pieces, check me again, I'm saying two pieces, am I wrong, Mike?
Yeah, it's three.
It is three. Then what am I missing? Damon Zick, Hector, Desmond, and Titus for Sax Quartet.
That's the first one, yeah.
Because I don't see it here, yeah. And
I have to get the back of the cover.
And then the Nada Pero Maquinas for Sax Quartet.
Hector, Desmond, and Titus, 3 for 4.
That's what I'm missing, 3 for 4.
And Nada Pero Maquinas.
Okay, sorry that I goofed on that one. And the soloists on this quartet, the other artists joining on this CD are Left Coast String Quartet. That's LA based, isn't it, Mike?
Yes.
LA musicians to play the John's Clarinet Quintet. And the sax quartet that is on this CD are names that I'm going to ask Mike to. Mike, by the way, plays in the quartet as well as flute, as I just mentioned, and clarinet. So it's really a very interesting CD, and what I like the most about it is that it's just completely, it's material that is not known and not played very much. I hope I'm not insulting anyone, but the point is this is good, yummy material for sax quartets to have a look at, certainly. The Clarinet Quintet is really nice. But let's begin a little bit to get everybody clear about who you guys are. And we are really speaking to John, who is a bi-continental sort of composer, has a home in Los Angeles as well as a home in the United Kingdom, and had quite a career. I think we had a conversation earlier where quite a career as a film composer. Let me try and get through this quickly. And what I decided I would do in approaching John's music was to have a look at the film music first. Just to, the trailers that are on the internet, just to kind of get a feel of what kind of a composer you are. And we can say that you're a melodist for sure. Yes, John? It's your turn.
I think that melody is essential, and for me, music, like the visual arts, has to be emotional. If there's no emotion and wonderful technique, it doesn't interest me at all. It has to move my heart. That applies to music, that applies to all the visual arts.
How about in terms of the many, many films that you wrote scores for, including a couple whose emotional music scared me to death as a kid? We talked about it earlier, your very first film. Did you run into any kind of troubles where you've just declared very clearly that what your intention as a composer is, but I wonder, did the studio step in and say, nah, you got to write it this way? I mean, how much trouble did you get from the studios, if any?
I got most of the trouble from the publishers. Most film companies, well, all film companies, the big film companies, have their own publishers. The publishers in the past were really interested in how they could exploit that music. And therefore they really did require melodies, which of course didn't offend me in any way because I love melody. But they really did have their say. They wanted something that the public would warm to, first and foremost. So
we're talking about like the LPs of film scores kind of thing, right?
Well, we're talking about film scores in general. There should be a melody. Having said that, the melody is not there really for a person to go to the movies to listen to music. If the music causes you to listen to it, then it's the wrong music. It should be there doing its own job, creating the emotion, telling people what the film is not able to tell you itself. For instance, you're looking at a house, there's been a murder in it. If you put happy music, there hasn't been a murder. If you put mysterious music, there probably has been some skullduggery gone on. But you're not listening to the music, it is talking to you and hiding at the same time.
Oh, that was brilliant, and I'm reminded again of, speaking of spooky mood music, your 1965 score to the film A Study in Terror. Here are my notes, creepy, scary, totally outrageous score, exclamation point. And that's my adult memory of being really, I remember seeing this film when I was in high school and scared the sense out of me for a bit. So well done, because I never looked to see who the composer was. Right? That I'm just supposed to be moved. Mike, let's do a little talk, because both of you have this tremendous camaraderie in the career in Hollywood, and I just want to make sure that everybody understands that Mike has had this huge career in Hollywood and playing, I mean literally everything. John will attest to this, everything in sight, and that's called Hollywood, where you're a studio musician. They say we need an English horn, and Mike is there with his English horn, or a clarinet or a sax or whatever. Why don't we start with Mike? Give me a little overview about this, because you both also have a kind of a youth in common about how you were wunderkinds in a way in your youth, playing with the big bands in America. Go ahead, Mike. Am I helping getting this started?
The way it worked for me is, first, I've always been interested in learning new instruments. But when I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, I asked my elementary school band director, I says, well, what secrets could you tell me to the music business? Because he worked in the music business besides being an elementary school teacher. And he says, be good at more than one thing. He said, that will guarantee you success. So I kept that in mind. And that's not actually why I picked up the other instruments. I was playing clarinet, and I heard the jazz band. I wanted to play with the jazz band, and there was no clarinet in it, so I had to learn saxophone. And then, of course, I got interested in flute, because that's part of that, too. And then many years later, I got interested in oboe, because I met Eddie Zolke, who was the oboe player on the Ed Sullivan Show, of all things, who was working in Las Vegas when I was working in Las Vegas. And he was a brilliant player, so I just had to learn how to do that, too. So to me, they're just tools. I mean, it's like, somebody building a house. You can be a hammer guy, or you can be a hammer guy and a wrench guy and a screwdriver guy. I mean, you can do everything, or you can do one thing. Either way. If you do one thing, you probably can excel at it a little faster, but you rob yourself of the other interesting things there are to do.
Oh, I noticed your eyebrows there, and the way I would translate it is it's called making a living in music, especially in Hollywood, right? It's like, oh, they need an oboist. Okay, quickly teach. I'll learn how to play oboe, and so on. John, remember, I think we may have touched on it, Mike. In your youth, you were quite a kind of wunderkind musician, right? You played with some of the big jazz bands in America, right?
That's how I got started. Yeah, I left college to play with Stan Kenton and Woody Herman and all those different kinds of bands, and Paul Horn, Harry James.
Meanwhile, in Britain, John, you as a young man were also playing in a lot of big bands, yes?
I got lucky, yes, yeah. And my luck really was, I wanted to be a clarinetist, and that I took up the saxophone, and I had a love of jazz. I was fortunate in being able to play both sides of the fence, that is jazz and symphonic music. And in those days, there were not a lot of saxophone players around, and I played the saxophone, and I got invited to play the things that were written for saxophone in symphony orchestras, and I played my way, which was very, very different to the way that the classical saxophone players played in those days. And it so happened that they liked it. So I was a very lucky person.
And that explains what used to be so, which is you'd fish for the 2 or 3 sax moments in the classical repertoire. And we had this discussion earlier. What I'm encountering, reviewing CDs, the whole world of professional classical saxophone is now really big, lots. And I think I hope I'm not exaggerating, but I think I really have about 8 or 9 serious classical saxophonists that I am in the process of interviewing or have interviewed. So the repertoire is growing, and this is the perfect segue into the CD, because as we mentioned, Damon Zick's pieces, those 3 that we'll discuss in a bit, Damon is also a sax player and plays in the Sax Quartet along with Mike that performs John's music. But just to kind of get you all you saxophonists out there, A Week in October. Why don't we just start there with John Scott's A Week in October for Sax Quartet, which is on this CD. Tell us that story. We spoke about it in previous chats, how you titled it, what it's about, and your love, of course, for saxophone.
I happened to have a little bit of time off. I wasn't working on a film. I wasn't doing arrangements. And I thought that I would like to write a saxophone quartet. And I set myself the task of writing it. It was October. October is notoriously bad and depressing in England. But at the same time, I didn't want to write a sad, depressing saxophone quartet. At least I hoped that it wouldn't turn out that way. As it happened, it took me more like a month than a week to write, but I cheated and I still called it A Week in October and picked 4 of the days. As if one can write a movement in a day, of course one can't, or at least John Scott can't. Probably other people can. Anyway, it was great fun, and at the time I was a saxophone player. Since then I had to give it up because I lost a lot of my jaw, which was also a good thing because that really turned me to writing seriously.
So I'm hearing a little echo, but so essentially a kind of calamity in terms of one aspect of your profession, playing, using your embouchure, your jaw, and so on, led to a career in composition. Have I kind of got that? Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, John, is that kind of what happened? In other words, film writing, more composition developed naturally out of the difficulty that you had playing, yeah?
Actually, it did develop out of that because up to that point I was quite a successful arranger. I was a pop arranger. I did I was musical director for people like Cilla Black, the Hollies. I played with the Beatles and all that kind of thing. And people wanted to keep me as an arranger. But I wanted to write, and people were saying, no, your future is as an arranger. Lucky for me, I developed a problem in the jaw, which meant that I was going to lose a lot of my jaw, which stopped me playing and really steered me into the desire to become a better writer, meaning a composer as well as an arranger. Or should I say, a composer first and foremost, and an arranger secondly.
Let's just, Mike, if I can kind of pull the conversation back to you for a minute, since we're beginning to talk about the repertoire that's on the CD. We've touched on A Week in October. Each movement is like Monday the 20th, Tuesday the 21st, and so on. Very, very clever. But my little notes talk about other wonderful things in this piece. This is really a marvelous piece for saxophone quartet. But how about Mike? The idea of preparing. I mean, as a musician, and professionally reading everything for years, all these years, how is John's material in terms of accessibility or even difficulty? I think we've touched on earlier conversations that this is challenging repertoire.
It is. Fortunately, the Sax Quartet is not quite as hard as the Clarinet Quintet was. But I mean, we had a saxophone quartet, have a saxophone quartet that rehearses every other week for a couple hours. And, after about a year, it becomes part of you. You just do it over and over and over again and kind of make adjustments and decide how it's going to be and, decide on tempos. And, John has his tempos and then we play our own tempos. And then when he hears them, when we record them, he kind of fixes them. And, so it's like, it's a really great thing. And it's just practice and repetition, which, I'll say this to any aspiring young musician, if you don't like repetition, don't get into music because you got to have a repetition. You start slow and you get faster.
And by the way,
that's still the way I learned today.
Yeah, exactly right. And also, just to mention again, Damon Zick. I see that I did somewhere. In other words, I've made notes about 3 or 4 as well for Sax Quartet. But Damon Zick, who plays in the ensemble in that quartet. How did you guys meet? I mean, the studio world is crazy, wonderful. But is there a little story there about how you met Damon Zick, saxophonist and composer?
Yeah, well, Damon was a kind of a jazz saxophone player in Florida, and he played with John DeVerse's little jazz band, and he did some recordings with John. And he came out here. He got the job to teach at Cal State Fullerton, and we were looking for a tenor player that would be appropriate for the group. And Gary Matsura, our soprano player, suggested him, and I'd never heard of him before, and he just walked in and was a perfect guy. So everybody in the Sax Quartet gets along fabulously, So.
And you speak about it in a way that we musicians know. You know what? Quartet, string quartet, sax quartet, any small chamber ensemble, you either get along or there's trouble. You know what I mean? It
yeah. There's a very obscure movie called A Late Quartet, which is about the recording of the last Beethoven quartet, and it's kind of an art movie, but it's fabulous, and it just shows the interaction of a quartet and how it works, and it's a pretty entertaining piece of filmmaking for any musician.
It's a comedy. It's a comedy.
I wouldn't say it's a comedy. No. It's okay. It's very complex. The first violin player, the second violin player wants to be the first violin player. The viola player wants to be a violin player. The cellist has Parkinson's.
Trouble.
And they're on the road all the time.
Trouble. So as everybody I hope out there can, this will all go up at Performing Arts Review, the interview, the links to buy the CD, all that good stuff. But so far, what we've discussed a little bit. Hang on, John. I'm getting to the Clarinet Quintet here. I hope all of you get this idea that this is a CD that has some really interesting Sax Quartet repertoire, some art music. I can say that. I hope, please, John, for Sax Quartet, your own passion, but the other passion, by the way, I'm a clarinetist, but though I don't like to tell anybody, I took an opportunity to go the easy route and become a conductor for a while. That's my excuse. But let's look now, John, and I want you to talk about a little bit the Clarinet Quintet, clarinet and string quartet. And let's see, the ensemble, I've got it up here, I just have to scroll up. The ensemble, again, is the Left Coast String Quartet. Tell me the story of the evolution of how you decided you thought you'd write a clarinet quintet for this classic gathering of instruments.
The clarinet was the instrument that I really wanted to be a performer on, for as long as I can remember. My father started me on the E-flat clarinet when I was about 6 years old.
Because of the fingering, yeah? The little E-flat.
Yeah, the smallest clarinet. And I think I was a fair clarinetist, but it was really my ambition to be a clarinetist. I joined the Army to learn music. I passed an audition and got into the Army band. Well, our Army band also had a wonderful orchestra, and each player had to play a military band instrument and an orchestral instrument. They put me onto the harp, which was, at the time for me, I thought it was a catastrophe, because I would now play the harp in the orchestra and the clarinet in the military band. So I became an orchestral harpist and the clarinet kind of wandered off. I developed a love of jazz, got myself a saxophone, and the clarinet became a doubling instrument. But I never lost my love of the sound of the clarinet. And the time came when I wanted to write a piece for the clarinet. And this is really why it happened. It was out of my pure love for the sound of the instrument, the love of the instrument.
And let's just to make sure about the date of composition, because I think from an earlier conversation you mentioned this was about 2014 or something. It was pretty recently, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
I would say 2016, 2017.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty recent.
Yeah, very nice. And let me see a little bit about some of my... And of course the clarinetist is Mike. Your turn.
Well, if I'd have known, I mean, listening to people like Mike Vaccaro, I mean, I never would have been a clarinetist. I love his sound. I love everything that he plays anyway.
So Mike gets to tell us just how hard it was. How hard is this quintet?
It took me 2 years to learn.
By the way, that's something. Let me just jump in for a second, because you told me this.
Can I apologize?
No, I don't apologize. Well, apologize to my wife.
There you go. But what I wanted to jump in.
Can I write another one and make it easier?
Yes, please.
Says he.
Oh, see, already an agreement has been made. But what I wanted to just mention is when you say it took me 2 years to learn the piece, what I appreciate is that speaks exactly to your kind of musicianship, Mike. There is nothing that I've heard, and you know I've heard several of your CDs, and we've had another earlier chat and a review. Did I write one yet or not? I can't remember. But anyway, bottom line is, your playing is always exactly there in place. Which is what I mean is, you're a studio musician. This is what is required, and therefore you will see to it. And that's what I love about your saying it took 2 years of study, because the Clarinet Quintet is difficult and beautifully structured, by the way, in terms of the narrative between string quartet and clarinet, but it's also played perfectly, meaning you don't put it on CD until it's perfect. Okay.
Well, at 72 years old, soon to be 73, it made me a better clarinet player. And that's the greatest thing about it. You know, I mean, it took 2 years, but in the 2 years, I became a much better clarinet player. And so, I mean, I'm appreciative of that.
Oh, good. And all of us.
I'm not saying it wasn't painful at times, but you know, learning's a painful process, right?
Yeah, and also considering that we are all, I'm 71, we're all kind of in our lovely, fabulous, I don't want to even use golden, but you know, we're actually what we're at is a point. I feel, I'm sure you all agree, I feel like I finally know my art. I mean, like finally, my lifetime. I'm 71, and now I'm finally beginning to understand it. What I'm saying is, it's about we're not over, we're not done with yet. Agreed, John?
I feel the same thing that you. I
agree.
I feel that I finally understand it.
Exactly. There you go. Exactly right. Now, how about this? Because on the CD, and I think you mentioned in your notes, there's just this thing about playing this one particular that every flute student plays, the Allemande from the A minor flute sonata, Bach solo flute sonata. Again, played beautifully. This is the thing that drives me out of my mind. How you can play all of these wind instruments so beautifully. What's this? As I recall, there's a little story. You have a special affection for this particular A minor sonata, or not? Tell me.
Well, I mean, I have an affection for all of Bach. I mean, I think Bach is the ultimate in writing. You know, 4-part writing, 2-part writing, 3-part writing, even solo writing, and I really understood, you know, harmony, and in a way that. He was the first one to really understand how to use harmony, you know, modern harmony. And it holds up till this day. And so I do like Bach. It tends to be difficult, and it tends to take a lot of practice, but I like practicing now. I didn't when I was younger, but I do now. And what I have found about the flute, you can force a clarinet or saxophone to play because it's in your mouth and there's a reed, and you can just force it to play if it's not cooperating. With the flute, it's just sitting in the air. and you have to kind of find a way to make it sing. And so I always practice flute first every day because, if I don't do it, everybody knows it, you know. And every day is different. Your lips are different every day. One day it's swollen, one day it's dry, one day it's this. And it's really about, the whole embouchure and what it's doing in your posture and everything else. So, I feel like I have to do it first every day when I practice because if I don't, I lose it.
Okay, let me speak to both of you because what has just been described, and I will admit that I am not well disciplined. Discipline, discipline, discipline. John, discipline. Let's talk about your, you don't like to use the word art music, but the kind of serious oeuvre that you have. Remember, we're talking about a man who also has written film scores that, as I recall, the list is like 21 films long. Discipline, discipline, discipline. What is it? How come? Why don't I have it? Speak, John.
Well, I've discovered late in life that it applies to writing just the same as playing. If you don't write for a few days, it's harder on the day that you start again. The more you write, the easier it gets. You just keep at it. And I think that applies to the player, particularly people like Mike Vaccaro, dare I say.
And
So,
Mike
I agree with that. And what I always tell my students is you only have to practice 1 minute a day because it's the idea of letting go of
Sorry, a big truck went by.
all the time. And so we have to let go of all of those things that are pulling on us and concentrate on this one thing. So if we do it for a minute, then it's very hard to practice for a minute. If you're interested at all, it'll be 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours or sometimes 3 hours. You just never know until you get tired, And I tell my students that, and I find out the ones that really want to play and the ones that don't just by whether they can do 1 minute a day or not. And the ones that can always practice more.
You both have just inspired me about my nemesis, which is writing reviews. The days go by, it becomes harder and harder to sit down and begin the process. So that's called 4 hours later, there's a review done. So thank you both for inspiring me on that one again. And that's it. I mean, we just have to get up and do it every single day, a little something, probably in all of life, frankly.
Right.
In order to have a happy and successful life. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay, good. Let me see what I'm sure I've forgotten something. We talked about the Clarinet Quintet, beautiful, wonderful, and again, John, listening to these trailers from so many of your music, so many of the films you've written music for. As you've said, you are a melodist, and that helped me to really fit comfortably into your music that I heard on this CD. Let's see, what am I forgetting here?
And a master of tonality also. He's a master in tonality. Even the stuff that's atonal sounds tonal to me.
And we've talked about that earlier, the idea, John, that while you are a melodist, and I notice it on this CD, but very carefully, very discreetly, once in a while you'll touch the edge. And to me, it's like, what hint is he dropping? What is the mood that he's describing? The edge of atonality. How does your mind work with dissonance?
I think dissonance is part of melody, for sure. I think you can think of tunes like, dare I say, Laura. I mean, it's a complicated tune. You can find dissonances if you look for them. I mean, I don't particularly look for dissonances as I'm writing. If they happen, and if they happen naturally, then I'm happy. Yeah. But like Bach wrote linear music. I try to write linear music. That linear music causes the harmonies automatically, and sometimes they might be dissonant. Quite a lot of the times they're constant. They look after themselves.
And do you ever look back on your compositions, again, because I'm so fixated on sound, that old volume from whatever, the 17th century, the idea that tonal centers, A major, C major, D minor, are developed to express a certain mood. Do you look back on your work from time to time? I hope this is not too stupid a question, and go, I wonder what was going on in my head when I gave it that little rough edge at that moment.
Yes, I do look back, and I'm amazed. I think to myself, I wonder why I did that, and I can't give myself an answer.
That's
9 times out of 10.
That's, well, intuitive.
But I can tell you the people that I love, people like Ravel, Debussy, the French composers, Bartok, they all write dissonant music, but to me it's melodic. I happen to like Schoenberg. I don't like a lot of Schoenberg's pupils, but I like Schoenberg. And he really went to the very, very end of consonance and dissonance.
But speaking of, I can't let you go away without speaking of consonance and dissonance, which you use in your film music. I'm thinking of the lovely scores, the big scores of Charlton Heston's film Antony and Cleopatra. There, you must have thought, I've got this, wonderful opportunity to write this glorious, Roman Empire type stuff. But also in The Wicker Tree, that's, I think, as of 2011, your last film. That one's jags the brain and the mind a little bit. The score is rough and tough and dissonant on occasion. So you seem to manage rather well in all of these areas, yeah?
I do get lucky from time to time.
You'll not let go of the luck, and how true, as we all know, how true luck is, as Mike even...
The luck that only experience can bring.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I add one
Sure.
little thing as well? One of my lucky days was actually meeting Mike, and I can remember it so well. Wasn't it? What was the film called now?
Becoming Colette.
Becoming Colette, yes. And I heard this beautiful alto saxophone player. It really did knock me out on the spot. And I'm longing to write a real serious saxophone rhapsody for that man, Mike Vaccaro. I hope I get the chance.
That brings us...
I hope to perform it.
And that brings us to events in the future. Mike produces CDs right, left, and center, so I can rest comfortably that you are not done yet, that there are other CDs in your head.
Well, I'm working on Cry Me a River right now, and the next one's going to be kind of a torch song, kind of a CD.
That's a good... Both of those are hints that are evocative and provocative. So I guess I noticed by your look, you're going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, because I've just started. I mean, that's the first tune I'm learning, and it takes about a month for me to learn a tune. So maybe we're 10 months away from a new CD.
Bingo, John. What's up? Have you written a symphony yet? And why don't you immediately?
I think I've written 3 symphonies. I don't call them symphonies. But to me, my symphonies are like diaries. They are events that have happened. And I keep a musical diary. In the case of an expedition I did up the Amazon, that's the Belém Symphony. It's in 4 movements. I wrote a symphony for Pasadena.
I read
the
that.
behest
I read about that
of
piece.
George Mester. Do you remember George
I
Mester?
do, of course, yeah.
Unfortunately, by the time I finished it, they had finished with George.
I remember that too.
I presented the symphony to them, and they said, "I'm sorry, everything has changed. We can't afford to perform it now." So I've got quite a few unperformed works.
How about opera? I'm just trying to remember what I've read.
I've also written an opera which has never been performed.
Yeah.
Once
How
again,
often do we hear this? It's tough. That's why I always wonder, why do composers spend 8 months writing an opera that they know more than likely will be very hard to produce? Well, of course, that doesn't matter. It's your inspiration.
Well, I never think like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there's always a chance, always the hope. And it either stays in your head and dies, or you put it on paper, and it ends up in a top drawer.
That is the problem with new music, whether it's modern sounding or whether it's tonal or orchestras are just afraid to take a chance on anything that's not the standard literature because most of their people come for the standard literature.
That's right.
And a lot of the literature that is not standard is not good. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if an orchestra will commission somebody and the piece will come out not palatable to the audience, which of course, you know, Stravinsky's had that happen. Everybody's had that happen, you know, the composers. However, some of it really isn't going to live any longer, you know, and I think audiences are afraid of that. And I think symphonies are afraid to spend a lot of money putting on something that they don't know what the outcome's going to be.
All for good reasons. It's called paying the light bill and so on. I mean, but in America, it's more the fear is more extreme. In Europe, there's a slightly better funding, although that's falling apart. But in Europe, I think the repertoire that I see is much more interesting, much more open-ended, new material, and so on. But I think managements, especially in North America, are afraid. You know, they're counting every single ticket sale, so it makes it much more difficult. Well, I believe, John, you have now committed on video to compose a clarinet rhapsody. Is that correct?
I think a saxophone rhapsody is what he wants to do.
Ah.
Yeah, saxophone rhapsody.
Oh, not clarinet. Okay, and that's for our friend Mike. Yes.
Am I committed on paper somewhere?
Well, please do, and then get on the phone and call Mike, okay? Listen, I think we better wind it down. I hope we've touched everything pretty much. We kind of danced all over the place, but I think we got a good overview of this, first of all, of composer John Scott and clarinetist Mike Vaccaro, and the contents of this tidy, amazing little CD, The Chamber Music of John Scott and Other Delicious Morsels. It's just one of those CDs, and I'll put it out to everybody on my e-blasts, but that sax ensemble players, in particular clarinetists, even a flutist, because by the way, Mike, you play that Bach movement in a very unique and very interesting manner, which is exactly right. Everybody has a different approach to these. It's exactly the point. And then these three wonderful pieces of Damon Zick for Sax Quartet.
Before you say goodbye to us,
yeah,
I want to thank you for doing your program and giving us that are not icons in the business that could play a chance to be heard and to be reviewed. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And from my point of view, I hear music I never, ever would have heard before. With all of this amazing repertoire coming out on CDs and musicians that are just to the moon and back in terms of music. I mean, it's fabulous. I haven't had a bad experience yet with all of these CDs that I've been looking at and trying to get a little action on. So many thanks, and it's more my pleasure than anything else. Okay, John Scott, Mike Vaccaro, thanks very much. We pulled it off. The electronics worked apparently today.
Yay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Till the next time.